Synod of Dordt in their original languages. I have 3 of the volumes here that you can peruse later, and some of them are in your library as well. Unfortunately, Dr. Sinnema is sick today, but Reverend Johannes Bogerman, the president of the Synod of Dordt, has agreed to step in his place. Thank you, Reverend Bogerman.
Wale, goeiedag. I am Johannes Bogerman, the esteemed but most humble president of the Synod of Dordt. I'm also a domine of the Church of Leeuwarden in the most wonderful province of Friesland. I've come today to lead you on a tour of the most significant synod of the whole Dutch Reformed tradition. In fact, it was one of the most important events in the history of our country, with great significance for politics, church, and culture of the Republic of the Netherlands. And I was there at the helm. Now, this venerable synod has just concluded a mere 400 years ago, so my memory of these events is still very fresh. Occasion for the synod. The Synod of Dordt was convened in the Dutch city of Dordrecht. The synod's primary goal was to settle the Arminian controversy that had agitated the Netherlands for over 20 years. The doctrine of grace was being threatened. The very truth that God had restored only 100 years before with Martin Luther in the Reformation. At that time, the Roman Catholic Church had downplayed grace by saying people needed to add good works to Christ's work of grace. Sadly, a century later, it was people within the Reformed churches who were denying the richness of grace. This new betrayal of grace, mainly about predestination and related points, touted that humans contribute to their own salvation. No, if grace needs the help of people, it is no longer grace. Now, Jacob Arminius originated this deviant teaching in the 1590s when he was a pastor at the Church of Amsterdam. The controversy became more heated after he became a professor of theology at Leiden University in 1603. At that time, there were only 2 universities in the Netherlands, one in Friesland, the other university was in Leiden, where there were only 3 professors of theology. So, in Leiden, Arminius was teaching most of the future ministers in the whole country. Now, at Leiden University, Arminius clashed with his colleague Franciscus Gomarus. Arminius taught that predestination was based on a foreknowledge of whether or not a person would choose to have faith. On the other hand, Gomarus taught that predestination was simply a sovereign decision of God's will without considering a person's sinfulness. After Arminius died, his followers drew up a document which summarized Arminius' teaching in 5 articles. The document was called the Remonstrance of 1610. Now, the following 5 articles were at the heart of the whole controversy, as it escalated all the way to the Synod of Dordt. Number 1, God predestined sinners based on his foreknowledge of faith or unbelief. 2, Christ died for all people, but only believers will be saved. 3, fallen man can prepare himself for grace. 4, God's grace is made available, but one can choose to accept or to resist that grace. And number 5, believers can fall from the state of grace. Now, because of these 5 articles, the Arminians became known as Remonstrants. The controversy became very heated, spread from the university to the churches to broader Dutch society, so much so that even the fishmongers in the Leiden fish market were arguing over predestination. Church and state were very much interwoven in the Dutch Republic, so the theological controversy became entangled with the political issues of the day and even threatened the country with civil war. Now, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the leading politician of the province of Holland, supported the remonstrant cause. On the other hand, the army commander, Prince Maurits of the House of Orange, supported the contra-remonstrant or Orthodox Reformed cause. Now, in a sense, the outcome of the remonstrant case was determined already in the political arena. When Prince Maurits, in the summer of 1618, disbanded the local militia in various Dutch cities and arrested Oldenbarnevelt for treason. And he replaced pro-remonstrant political officials with officials who supported the contra-remonstrant cause. Nevertheless, in spite of all this political intrigue, our venerable synod was determined to give the remonstrants a fair hearing and a fair judgment. Now, after almost a decade of strife in the church and state, the Dutch government, the high and mighty States General in The Hague, decided that a national synod should be held to settle the controversy. The States General paid for most of the expenses of the synod for a whole 6.5 months, well over 100,000 guilders. Now, since the States General was basically in charge of the synod, it also sent its own state delegates to the synod to act on its behalf. Now, location and facilities. The synod was hosted by the oldest city in Holland, Dordrecht, which was on an island surrounded by 3 rivers. It was the city where 30 years earlier, the Dutch Republic was founded under the leadership of William of Orange. Dordrecht was a prominent center of international commerce during the Golden Age, when the Dutch ships ruled the seas. And so it was to this city of Dordrecht that the synodical delegates came by boat, of course. This is what they saw when they arrived in the harbor. They were welcomed to the city at the Groothoofspoort, a decorative gate to the city from the river. The synod itself met in the Kloveniersdoelen, the grand clubhouse of the local Musketeers Guild. There the clovers, or guns of the guards, were stored. Now, the Kloveniersdoelen was renovated for the synod by the city carpenter. Special benches were installed on the 2nd floor for over 100 delegates. And each delegate was given a real luxury of a foot warmer with coals to ward off the bone-chilling cold of our dank Dordrecht winter. Now, I should admit, though, that during the course of the synod, 4 delegates died and 3 went home sick. So it might be said that being a delegate was a bit of a health hazard. For official public ceremonies at the beginning and end of the synod, we use the magnificent 11th century Grote Kerk. After the synod was over, the stately Cloveniers meeting hall fell into disrepair. And sadly, it was torn down after 200 years to make way for a prison. Now, however, on this site is a modern building of the Court of Justice. Really ugly compared to our grand Golden Age style, but at least they put up a little picture of the synod and a commemorative sign. Participants of the synod. Now, this was a national synod of the Dutch Reformed churches, but our synod also had an international character, as is evident from the participants. So there were 11 Dutch delegations at the synod. 9 of these delegations were sent from the 9 Dutch provincial synods. Now, most of these provincial synods sent 4 ministers and 2 elder delegates. Almost all were contra-remonstrants, since the remonstrants were a minority in the country. The Walloon or French Reformed churches in the Netherlands also sent 1 delegation. And there was a separate delegation of 5 theologians from our Dutch universities and academies. So there was a total of 58 Dutch delegates. Now, in addition to the Dutch delegates from our country, we sought the help of Reformed theologians from other countries to deal with this Arminian controversy. So there were 26 foreign delegates from 8 foreign countries which had Reformed churches: Great Britain, the Palatinate, Hesse, 4 Swiss cantons, Nassau, Geneva, Bremen, and Emden. We even had an Anglican bishop in attendance, the Honorable George Carleton, head of the British delegation. Now, to show him proper honor, we built a canopy over the British benches. Now, theologians from the Reformed churches in France were actually on their way, but the Catholic King of France refused to let them attend. But to show deference to the French, we left their seats open beside the British. The foreign theologians had full voting rights along with the Dutch delegates. There were also 18 state delegates representing the States General. Their role was to give direction on procedural matters and to ensure that the synod did not impinge upon political affairs. But they did not enter into the theological issues. Now, a final group of participants at our Venerable Synod were not actual delegates. 13 remonstrant leaders were summoned to appear before the Synod to have their views examined. We needed to judge whether any of the remonstrant views deviated from the accepted doctrine of the Dutch Reformed churches. Now, Leiden theologian Simon Episcopius was their spokesman. we sent these 13 leaders letters of citation requiring them to appear before us within 14 days. They were called in these letters to state, explain, and defend their views of the 5 remonstrant articles. They were also supposed to submit any doubts they had about the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism. Now, when they were there, the cited remonstrants were seated around a table in the middle of the hall right in front of me. My seat was at the table by the fireplace, along with 2 secretaries and 2 vice presidents. Sometimes it got a little warm by the fireplace, but the heat in the room was not just from the fireplace. Now, the seating arrangement in the hall honored the rank of the delegations. To my right were the state delegates and their secretary. To my left were all the esteemed foreign delegates, first the British, French, and the rest. Farther to my right were the 5 Dutch theologians on the top bench, with the other Dutch delegates next to them and in the benches in the back. Now, for open sessions, spectators could stand behind the fence in the back or sit up in the 2 balconies in the room. In the best places sat a lot of women and girls who came to take in the spectacle. Because of the foreign delegates, we conducted the synod in the Latin language, since that was the only language that everyone knew. Latin was the language of the university, where our ministers were trained, whether at Leiden University, Geneva Academy, Heidelberg University, or our own renowned Frisian University at Franeker, my alma mater. Actually, my preference was to speak Fries at the synod. Fries, the language of the Garden of Eden. But since all the sinners were cast out of the garden, now only the good Frisian people know this language. Now that reminds me of the story of St. Boniface, one of the first Christian missionaries to our Frisian people. Now, one day at Dokkum, St. Boniface came upon a group of Frisians having a most violent argument with a visiting Dutchman. They were arguing about whether Fries was a language or a dialect. To settle the matter, they turned to St. Boniface. In my humble opinion, he said, I think Fries is neither a language nor a dialect. Fries is a speech impediment. For that bit of impertinence, St. Boniface met the axe at the hands of the furious Frisians. The poor martyr, St. Bonifacius, blessed be his immortal soul. But I must say, on this matter, all my sympathies are with my Frisian compatriots. But now we must get back to our tour of the Venerable Synod. Procedures of the Synod. First of all, voting was done by delegation, not by individual delegate. On any issue, advice was presented by all 19 delegations following the order of their rank. First, the foreign theologians by order of their international status in relationship to the Dutch Republic, British first. And then the Dutch delegations according to their seating order in the States General. Now, we usually expected that the advice of the delegations be written, and each was actually read in the synod. Now, based on all of this advice of the 19 delegations, we synod officers drew up a common synodical decision. Revisions were made by the full synod, and then I called for final approval. Now, on doctrinal matters, the only standard that was allowed to determine truth was the Bible, not any human writings. This was actually spelled out in the government articles to convene the synod. Now to the phases of the synod. Our Venerable Synod met for 6.5 months, from November 13, 1618 to May 29, 1619, a total of 180 half-day sessions. The general proceedings of the synod consisted of 4 phases. 1, the pro acta sessions lasted about 3 weeks before the cited remonstrance arrived. 2, when they arrived in December, the synod was largely entangled in procedural bickering with them for 5 long weeks, until finally I expelled them from the synod in mid-January. Number 3, after their expulsion for almost 4 months, we examined remonstrant writings and prepared our response. Now, based on the advice from each of these delegations, our synod issued its judgment, the Canons of Dordt, a document dear to my heart. 4th phase, in the post acta sessions, after the foreign theologians returned home, the Dutch delegates focused on other matters pertaining to the Dutch churches. So now let's look at each of these 4 phases. Number 1, the pro acta sessions. From November 13 to December 5, the synod was occupied with opening formalities and various non-theological matters. After opening ceremonies at the Grote Kerk, the officers of the synod were selected. I, Johannes Bogerman, as president, and also 2 secretaries and 2 vice presidents. Now, since the primary reason for holding the synod was to deal with the remonstrant controversy, we decided to summon a group of 13 remonstrant leaders. While we waited for them to arrive, we addressed several matters. First, there was a great need for a new Dutch Bible translation based on the original Hebrew and Greek. We authorized a new translation just a few years after the English King James Version of 1611. But it was not until 20 years later that our work was completed. The government actually financed this Statenvertaling, or States Bible. What a masterpiece. Next, we discussed the topic of catechizing. We drew up several guidelines for catechism preaching, which was sorely neglected in some places in the Netherlands. We also discussed the best ways of teaching the catechism in all 3 spheres of the Christian home, Christian school, and church. Third topic, we also dealt with the issue from the Dutch colonies in the East Indies about whether slave children who were part of Christian families should be baptized. Fourth, we adopted some regulations for the training of students preparing for ministry in the Dutch Reformed churches. And finally, there was a great concern that the printing of remonstrant ideas was not being well regulated. So the Synod also addressed abuses in the printing trade. That was phase one. Phase two, procedural bickering with the remonstrants. When the 13 remonstrants who were summoned came to the Synod, we argued for more than a month about just procedural matters. The remonstrants first appeared on December 6, and I expelled them 5 weeks later on January 14, before we even got to any of the real theological issues. Now, the remonstrants were led by Simon Episcopius. The day after they arrived, Episcopius delivered a long and tedious oration to explain the motives and background of the remonstrant position. After his speech, I told him he did not even have permission to speak. I also asked him for a copy of his speech, but he said he had no other copy. But then we found out that he did have another rough copy, so I naturally accused him of lying. He strongly denied lying and contended that he had no other copy neatly enough written out. But I never heard him say that. And he was sitting right there in front of me. The fundamental cause of the procedural bickering was the fact that the two sides identified the central issue of the controversy differently. Now, for the Synod, the main issue was remonstrant doctrinal deviation in their view of predestination. The remonstrants said that God predestines or chooses people based on their faith that God foresees that a person will choose to have in the future. Now, that view grants the decision to the person, not to our sovereign God. On the other hand, for the remonstrants, the main issue centered on extreme views of reprobation, advocated by certain Reformed theologians. Now, the Synod wanted to judge their false teachings about predestination. The remonstrants wanted full freedom to refute contra-remonstrants' views of reprobation. But since they were not delegates, they did not get to set the agenda. So they tried every chance they could to push the issue of reprobation into the discussion. Now, already when the remonstrants first arrived, they raised the issue of the Synod's authority. They wanted this to be a conference where we would all discuss the issues as equal parties. Now, we already had such a conference of equals in the 1611 Hague Conference. It did not solve anything. The remonstrants protested that they could not recognize the Synod as their lawful judge because they said our members were the opposing party in the conflict, and because many of our Dutch delegates had participated in schisms. Now, for the Synod, the crux of the issue was whether the Church has a right to judge doctrinal views that deviate from our Reformed confessional standards. Of course, we had the right and solemn obligation to guard the Church against these false teachings. Now, I demanded that the remonstrants produce their observations on the Belgic Confession and Heidelberg Catechism. This also caused problems. They wanted their 5 articles to be treated first. I demanded that they present their doubts about the confessions right away. It was known that they accepted the words of the confessions, but interpreted them differently. So for weeks we argued about every little thing. Could they only discuss their view of election, or also treat reprobation? Should they positively state their views, or could they negatively refute opposing views? Should they present their views orally or in writing? Should they answer questions before or after presenting their own explanations? Should they answer our questions individually or as a group? And who gets to decide how much time they were allowed to talk? Now, in these debates, both sides did make some concessions, but in the end, we could not agree on procedure. When I tried orally to examine the remonstrants with questions that I posed to them individually, they refused to answer. It was so frustrating. In the new year, the state delegates at the Synod sent a delegation to the States General in The Hague to report on the remonstrant obstinance and to receive its direction. Now, the States General issued a resolution that approved our actions at the Synod and ordered the remonstrants to submit. If they would not cooperate, the States General said we should dismiss them and examine their opinions from their writings. So we then recalled the remonstrants, and I tried to examine them one last time. I asked a question from a prepared list, but again, they refused to answer. Then Episcopius made a concession. He said, if freedom to explain, defend, and refute as much as they thought necessary were granted to them, they were ready to receive that list of questions and answer them in writing. I refused to hand over the list. Then by a majority, the Synod decided to examine the remonstrants from their writings, just as the States General had authorized. But I still gave them until Monday, January 14th, to submit. Now, in the meantime, on Saturday, the state delegates met privately with the remonstrants for a final try to get them to cooperate. But it was hopeless. So then on January 14, Monday, I called in the remonstrants and asked them to state categorically, yes or no, whether they would obey the Synod and the States General. Episcopius replied by submitting another very long document explaining their position. But in it, he defiantly stated that the remonstrants could not in good conscience obey the Synod's decrees. At that point, I lost my patience, and I angrily expelled the remonstrants from the Synod in a most passionate speech. I rehearsed the Synod's dealings with the remonstrants and accused them of great obstinacy, deceit, and lies. Finally, I expelled them with the words, "In the name of the state delegates and the Synod, you are dismissed. Get out, get out, exite, exite." As they were leaving, I overheard one of the remonstrants declare, "Out from this assembly of the wicked, they were not a bit happy. However, I believe we gave them a fair chance to explain themselves, but they simply did not want to cooperate. Now, while my manner of expelling the remonstrance was perhaps, shall I say, a little bit less than tactful, I must say this: I did not expel them just in a fit of anger. The States General and the Dutch delegates and foreign delegates all had advised their dismissal. Phase 3, preparing the Canons of Dordt. After the remonstrants were expelled, our Venerable Synod spent 3 more months carefully examining their views from their writings and preparing our judgment on the remonstrant case, popularly known, of course, as the Canons of Dordt. Now, in this phase, we usually had good discussions, but sometimes the discussions got a little heated between some of the delegates. Professor Johannes got into such a dispute with Martinius of Bremen over the role of Christ in election that he actually challenged him to a duel. He had to be restrained lest they come to blows. Meanwhile, the remonstrants had to stay in another room in the Cloveniersdoelen, and they continued to submit long and tedious written explanations and defenses of their 5 articles. We patiently read most of them. Sometime in those cold winter months, Rudolphus Goclenius, the hoary professor of philosophy from Marburg, drank a little too much as he was warming his feet in front of the fireplace at his lodgings. He fell asleep and burned the bottom of his feet. He could not attend the synod for more than a week. Over the course of these couple of months, many of the Dutch and foreign delegates gave wonderful speeches as we discussed the Bible's 5 main teachings in the controversy. And let's quickly look at those. Number 1, we are elected or chosen to be saved only by God's saving grace. 2, Christ died only for the elect, but his death is sufficient for all. 3, fallen sinners are unable to save themselves. 4, we are redeemed by the effective and powerful grace of the Holy Spirit. And 5, we are preserved in God's care until the end of life. Now, our process for drafting the canons was very careful and elaborate. In this phase, all 19 delegations of the Synod presented their advice on each of those 5 remonstrant articles. There were some 80 of these judgments, and we read them all. Finally, it was time to drop a single judgment of the Synod on the remonstrant case based on the advice from all of these 19 delegations. So I took it upon myself as president of the Synod to drop the Synod's judgment in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the canons, corresponding, of course, to the remonstrant article 1 and 2. Now, it took me 4 drafts to come up with a version that I finally dictated to the Synod, but to my surprise, there was a bit of an uproar, especially from some of the foreign delegations. They thought I was trying to drop the canons all by myself and then just seek the Synod's approval. I was somewhat taken aback, but I complied when the state delegates proposed that a drafting committee of 9 do the work of drawing up the canons. By the way, I've got samples of those early drafts on the tables there. Now, along with the 2 vice presidents, Rolandus and Facelius, and me, of course, as president, the drafting committee was made up of 3 foreign theologians, Bishop Carleton, Scultetus from Heidelberg, and Diodati from Geneva, and 3 Dutch theologians, Polyander, Walaeus, and Trigland. For the next 3 weeks, the Synod did not meet in regular sessions, but our committee worked diligently to draft the canons. The committee graciously started with my draft and kept revising until we reached the final version. Now, our first committee draft was dictated to the Synod, and the 19 delegations had then the opportunity to offer suggestions for improvement on that draft. Then our drafting committee revised it and dictated it again to the various delegations for their ongoing suggestions. Now, we went back and forth like this for a 3rd committee draft, and in all there were 8 drafts of chapter 1 alone. Now, we wrote up the canons in 5 chapters, the chapters 3 and 4 combined, in response to the 5 remonstrant articles on predestination and related points. That was the specific focus of the canons. So the canons are not intended to present a comprehensive summary of Reformed theology. We decided that each chapter of the canons should have 2 parts, a negative and a positive section. The rejection of errors section, of course, was primary, because the whole reason for the canons was to bring a judgment on the remonstrant errors. But we thought it was also advisable to add a positive section for each chapter so that the churches would know the Orthodox Reformed teaching about these 5 points of controversy. Now, this whole process took us 3 weeks. And then the Venerable Synod met again in full session to make some final changes. At long last, on April 23, every delegation approved and signed each chapter of the canons. The blessed canons of Dort, Soli Deo Gloria. Now, even though I was on the drafting committee for the canons, may I be so bold as to offer a few words about the canons? First, the canons are thoroughly based on the Bible. Every member of the Synod had to swear an oath that all deliberations on doctrine would be based on Scripture alone and not on any human writing, not even John Calvin. So the canons are chock full of Bible references. Also, the leading Reformed theologians of Europe were here in Dordrecht working on the canons. So the canons are no sham condemnation of remonstrant views. They are carefully crafted by the most scholarly theologians of the day. Now, in my humble opinion, the canons are the best statement ever written about the relationship of God's sovereignty and human responsibility. The canons present in very careful terms the delicate balance between God's sovereign work of grace and our salvation, and our human responsibility to respond in faith and obedience. Always giving, of course, priority to God's grace. Now, first of all, the canons emphasize that our salvation is totally by God's grace from beginning to end, and not by our human deeds or choices. God took the initiative in saving us human sinners, even deciding way back in eternity to graciously elect or choose us for eternal life, long before we were even born or did any human deed. God gives the gift of electing grace. How deep is the amazing love of God for people who do not deserve it. Amazing grace. Yet, the canons fully recognize, even though salvation is totally God's work, as he gives this gift of electing grace, we humans must respond in faith and obedience. But it's not 50-50, as if God comes to us halfway to offer grace, and then it's our responsibility to reach out and accept that grace. No, that's the Arminian view. Salvation is totally 100% by God's grace. God's grace works to change our sinful hearts and enables us to respond in faith. In fact, at the very moment God changes our hearts, we are able to respond through the Holy Spirit working in us. So, believing is actually our action and responsibility, but at the same time, it's totally a gift of God. I also want to say something about how pastoral the canons are. Ah, such blessed assurance. If you're struggling with doubts about your election or salvation, the canons will guide you to look at your life for the fruits of election, such as faith, sorrow for sin, hunger for righteousness. To look to God's promises about salvation, and to look for the testimony of the Holy Spirit that assures you that you are the child of God. Then you can be absolutely sure that nothing can separate us from God. The canons also give comfort to believing parents who lose a child in infancy. At the same time, the canons also challenge false security, laxity, and indifference. I could go on and on about the blessed canons, but we must continue our tour of the Synod. After the canons were adopted, we drew up a sentence deposing the 15 cited remonstrants from their offices in the ministry. And we reviewed the Belgic Confession and Heidelberg Catechism. All of the delegates affirmed that the doctrine contained in the Confession and Catechism fully agrees with God's Word. Finally, on the 6th of May, with great pomp and circumstance, we solemnly processed from our meeting hall to the Grote Kerk of Dordrecht. Following 2 coaches full of ladies, the state delegates first led the procession down the street, then our synod members 2 by 2. When all delegates, along with a vast concourse of spectators, were seated in the church, I mounted the high pulpit and offered a prayer in the Latin tongue for about a half hour. I thanked God profusely for the harmonious outcome of this venerable synod. Then, Our two secretaries ascended a podium in front of the choir stalls where the dignitaries were seated and took turns reading aloud each chapter of the canons until their voices were hoarse, publicly proclaiming this blessed document to the whole world. Secretary Demanus then read the names of every delegate who had signed the canons. Each man doffed his hat as his name was called. A few days later, we dismissed the foreign theologians with generous words of thanks for their willingness to come and help us deal with our crisis here in the Netherlands. Then followed a magnificent banquet. The whole synod was plentifully treated with meat and drink. Our ears were entertained with agreeable stringed music, and women sang from behind the curtains. The state delegates presented each of the foreign theologians with a costly gold medallion picturing our Venerable Synod. I actually have one right here. You can look at it later. Then the foreign theologians left for home, stopping in The Hague on the way. There, some of them witnessed the beheading of Oldenbarneveld, who was convicted of treason. May God have mercy on his immortal soul. Phase 4, the post-docta sessions. After the foreign theologians were dismissed, the Dutch delegates stayed for another 3 weeks to deal with matters of concern to the Dutch churches. Then we switched language from Latin to Dutch. We read and revised the most recent church order of 1586. The result was our wonderful church order of Dordt, which would govern church life for generations. We approved rules for observing the Sabbath, which we asked the States General to implement. We drew up a new form of subscription for ministers. By signing, we agree that our Canons of Dordt, along with the Belgic Confession and Heidelberg Catechism, do fully agree with the Word of God. And we made some revisions now to the text of the Belgic Confession. And we requested that the States General convene the next National Synod in 3 years. Sadly, of course, there would not be another Dutch National Synod for about 200 years. That makes our venerable Synod, Synod of Dordrecht, all the more significant. Now, on the 29th of May, our Blessed Synod finally ended, again with a procession to the Grote Kerk. Aftermath. The leading remonstrants were banished from the country by the States General, but a few years later they were allowed to return. The provincial synods deposed about 200 remonstrant ministers from the ministry in the Dutch Reformed churches. But the remonstrants soon went on to form their own church community, the Remonstrant Brotherhood. After the synod concluded, the official documents of the synod were gathered together and bound in 17 folio volumes. Now, these were kept in a large trunk, which was secured with 8 locks. Each of the 7 provinces and the States General were given keys. And every 3 years, representatives from these 8 bodies would come with their keys to The Hague to open the trunk and check the state of the archives for mold or vermin. Now, 400 years later, the 17 folio volumes are housed in the Utrecht's archive. Other Synod of Dordt documents are scattered in about 25 European archives, where a guy named Don Sinnema has been scrounging around trying to discover every last bit of paper generated by our esteemed Synod. He and an international team of cronies hope to publish, for the first time in 400 years, all the documents of the Synod of Dordt. Well, good luck, or should I say good providence. I hope he is careful with our precious handwritten manuscripts. Now, 3 of those the first 10 volumes are on the table there. Well, before I end, let me not forget about one more participant at our Venerable Synod. There was a devout dog who was so curious that he attended most of the sessions. After 6.5 months of avidly following the intense synodical deliberations, the Dordt dog was still left scratching his head. But for those of us who for 6 months sincerely considered the mystery of God's salvation, we left the great Synod of Dordrecht eternally grateful for how the King of the universe saves us by grace alone. And nothing can ever take us away from him. Soli Deo Gloria. Guess we have time for questions, or
I think we do. If any have them, raise your hand and ask.
Mm-hmm.
You said in 1611, if I heard correctly, the Synod at Hague was a discussion with the remonstrance that got nowhere. Could you touch on that just a little bit more?
Yeah, in 1611, the states of Holland organized this conference, and this was a genuine conference with, I think, 6 people on each side, and they were supposed to work out their differences and come to an agreement. Now, 1611, that's 1 year after the remonstrance of 1610, so it's very soon, very fresh. They met for a couple of months, I think, and exchanged all kinds of papers from one side to the other. It was quite systematic, but they just could not agree on the issues. So that conference idea just didn't work. Mm-hmm.
I've heard that there was a disagreement among some of the delegates to the Synod. Some were hypothetical universalists and something like that. They all signed the document, though. Do you know if they resolve those differences? Or?
Yeah, that has to do with Article 2, whether Christ died for only the elect or for all people. And there was some genuine difference of opinion among delegates on that issue, especially the Bremen delegates, including Martinius, and about half of the British delegates, including John Davenant and Samuel Ward. They took the position that was later known as hypothetical universalism, which is really associated with Moise Amaro, so that's the next generation. And so that issue really didn't come to the fore until the Amaro controversy. But sort of the early stages of that, you already had differences at the Synod. Now, there were debates on the floor of Synod that even got a little heated, and it was finally resolved, if you could say resolved, by having all of the delegates agree to a somewhat of a compromise formula. The canons actually accommodate a wide range of thinking within the Reformed tradition. You can't expect all theologians to think exactly alike, so the canons expressed their language in such a way that each side could agree to that. And so in the canons chapter 2, you see a couple of articles that talk about God's or Christ's salvation as sufficient for all. That part is to accommodate those group of delegates. On the other hand, the main position of chapter 2 is that Christ died only for believers. So Christ died effectively. It's a scholastic distinction between efficiency and sufficiency, going back to Lombard, that was taken up and basically popularized in the canons. But by using that distinction, they were able to accommodate the differences without more controversy. And they were really intent on having a unanimous support for the canons. They didn't want the world to think that here the Synod kicked out the remonstrance, but still they couldn't agree among themselves. Everyone signed the canons. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is your evaluation of Prince Moritz and his seizure of power, his execution of Oldenburg?
Yeah.
Is he doing this as a sincere Orthodox believer? Is there a lot of political motivation here?
Well, first of all, political, of course. He, as the leading member of the House of Orange, was often present at the States General when they were discussing major issues. So, he had his voice there. But he stood on one side, and Oldenbarneveld, who was the advocate of Holland, the province of Holland, they didn't get along very well. And Oldenbarneveld, of course, supported, or at least sympathized. He wasn't really that theologically astute, but he sympathized with the remonstrance. And Prince Moritz sympathized and probably sincerely believed the Orthodox Reformed position. At a certain point, he actually participated in the Lord's Supper, an Orthodox church Lord's Supper in The Hague, and that that was kind of a public statement that he was in support of the Counter-Remonstrant cause. But still, the politics of the situation were dominant in that whole conflict.
Are the acts and the other documents in the Senate being digitized, or have they been?
Yeah,
As you discovered
yeah.
that?
Volume 1 of this series, Acta et Documenta, contained the actual Acta Authentica of the Synod. That's an interesting story in itself. The published Acta, and I have my copy of the original Latin Acta of 1620, which you can use or look at. It's falling apart, so just turn pages carefully, but you can see the original Acta there. They were published by the States General. So there was a political motivation to get the ACTA out, and its main motivation was to show the world, especially those 8 foreign countries that sent their theologians to Dordrecht, to let them know what happened. So that was published, but certain things were left out. Daniel Heinsius, the secretary of the state delegates, was the main editor of that. He left out parts that did not show the Dutch Republic in a good light, or the controversial aspects of the Synod. They're toned down or left out. One good example, which I didn't really mention here, but Johannes Bogerman was a theologian in Franeker. He was known for being extremely scholastic in his teaching. And he conflicted with his colleague, Lubertus, and that issue finally ended up at the Synod, and it was dealt with for, maybe 6 sessions or so. And they came out with a statement which did not condemn Bogerman, because they recognized that using scholastic language was quite common in Reformed theology of the day. So they didn't condemn the use of scholastic theology, but they basically warned against an excessive use of scholastic type theology. So essentially they gave Bogerman a slap on the wrist and told him to moderate a bit. Anyway, that whole case in the Latin Acta is simply called, in one line, the Frisian case was discussed. No details, because you don't want the foreign countries to think negative thoughts about what happened at the Venerable Synod, right? Another thing, the more Dutch-focused aspects of what happened are either toned down or omitted. So the post-acta, which is actually the most important part of the acts of the Synod with respect to church order. Remember those last 3 weeks, the post-acta sessions? And the Church Order of Dordt was formulated from an earlier version of 1586. But all that discussion in the post-acta is totally omitted. It wasn't even included in the Latin, in the published acta. So, and there are lots of other examples of kind of the political motivation in the actual publication of the acta. And of course, it was paid for by the States General and so on to get it printed. I didn't realize that until I was heavily involved in this project and found out that there was another version, Acta Authentica, as the name indicates, the authentic acts of the Synod, signed by Festus, Homius, and so on, the scribe at the Synod. That's the real, those are the real acta. It was never published until 2015, our major project put out the Acta Authentica, and it's in the first volume, which you'll see there. So that's the first time it's actually available. Other things, other forms of acta are also published in that volume, because not only the Acta Authentica, but there was a contracted version of the Latin Acts that the States General wanted to make available, which was never published again, but it's a contracted version which we published there. And then finally, the state delegates themselves met many times separately. So the state delegates met as part of the synod, especially to give advice on procedure and so on. But between times, they would have their own meetings in a different room in the synod hall. And all of those acta, which were in Dutch, were never published before. So we published those as well. So.
And then what about digitizing?
Oh yes, your question about digitizing. Yeah, the whole series is published by Van den Hoek and Ruprecht from Göttingen. And yeah, we're very thankful that they're bearing the total cost of publication. But we have to have everything in final form. So all they have to do is print it. But they also have agreed to put out a digital version. You have to pay for it, but they, along with the printed version, they put out a digital version. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm intrigued that in this great synod, the issue of baptism came up with respect to slave children.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting
One
issue.
that can divide reform. It has to do with baptism and explanation of the significance of baptism. Do you know what the decision was in the end with respect to baptizing slave children?
Yeah. That, of course, was a major issue because of the expansion of the Dutch Empire in the Golden Age, and especially in the East Indies. And in many cases, you know, there would be Dutch traders, or mostly Dutch traders are associated with the trade industry. They would be living there, and they would have slaves as part of their family, including children. So the whole issue of slavery, of course, is related here. Now, the Synod of Dordt did not itself deal with the issue of slavery. It just dealt with that practical issue of whether these Christian families in the East Indies could have their slave children baptized. At the synod, there was a good discussion about that, and two very clear points of view. Some said yes, some said no. And in the end, the synod decided that slave children could be baptized, not as infants, but only when, after some instruction, when they reached years of discretion, you know, that language, then if they were committed to the Christian faith, they could be baptized at that point. So that was really the final resolution of that.
But not as infants.
But not as infants, right? Or really young children. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Well, I think for the sake of our students then, we'll call it an afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Sinnema. And we look forward next week
Yes.
for your presentation with church order and historical perspective. I think
Yeah, I'll focus on the background of the Church Order of Dordt, because the Church Order of Dordt did not just originate at Dordt. It's basically the culmination of a process that goes back to the first synod, Dutch Synod of 1571 in Emden. So there are a number of different versions until the Church Order of Dordt, and then the Church Order of Dordt the idea was that church order would be open to revision, but of course, there was no synod for 200 years. So that also meant that the Church Order of Dordt sort of remained in place for that amount of time until the major reorganization of 1816, where the church becomes a department of the state and the Church Order of Dordt gets thrown out. So I'll be looking at the development of the church order and what it emphasizes and so on next time.
Good, thank you. We'll look forward to that, and all, of course, are invited back.
I'd like to also thank my wife Carla. She's a big part of this particular presentation because she put together some 240 slides that she created for this presentation. This costume, she researched it and fabricated the whole thing, which took a lot of work, but she did a very nice job. And so.
Behind every good Dutchman is a Dutch woman.
But you grew the beard yourself.
Yeah, right. Now, please feel free to look at the display items that I've got out there, and I'll answer any further questions.
Thank you so much.
I'll put the medal out here too.
Almost like looking at the Torah, huh?
Ah.
Are you interested in one of my medallions?
Oh.